find yourself feeling extremely fatigued, like you're not getting enough sleep, you can't lose weight, despite doing all the right things, such as eating a healthy diet, exercising, but you still feel like you're not getting anywhere. This could actually be related to a dysregulation in a hormone called cortisol. When I was a medical student, I was originally taught that cortisol was a hormone that was released occasionally when somebody was under stress and not something that could cause a more chronic condition. Now, there are chronic conditions related to cortisol imbalances where your cortisol is either way too high or way too low. They are called Cushing's disease or Addison's disease. But we never really talked about how cortisol can also be impacted in a more chronic way and how it can cause more subtle symptoms. So cortisol does a lot more than just help our bodies in stressful situations. It actually helps us to break down energy. So it helps us to break down things like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in our body. It is also an immune regulator. So it helps to suppress our immune system as well. These are all things that happen in our body that are much different than just helping us get through stress. It also helps to balance our blood sugar. Cortisol has a huge impact on insulin and works together with insulin. And what usually happens is cortisol helps our blood sugar increase. So the reason this happens is years ago when our ancestors were faced with a stressful situation, they had to have energy, right? Their muscles had to have energy to run away from that stressful situation. That release of cortisol helps to increase our blood sugar so that we have a readily available source of energy that our muscles have, our brain, our heart has, so that we could use that energy quickly from our bloodstream so that we could get away from whatever it was that was threatening us. Another thing that cortisol does is it helps regulate our circadian rhythm. Cortisol tends to peak in the morning just before we wake up. It's like a wake up signal for our body to get up and get going. It tends to slowly come down throughout the day and becomes very low just before we go to sleep. And that is also what helps us fall asleep. So what are some symptoms of high cortisol and low cortisol? With high cortisol, you would tend to feel very anxious. You would have trouble falling asleep. You would have a lot of sugar cravings or cravings for fatty foods. Whereas with low cortisol levels, you would feel very fatigued and sluggish and just like you had no energy. But there's also a mix of the two where you have this kind of tired but wired feeling. And that usually happens when there's huge fluctuations in either way of cortisol. With that tired and wired feeling, you could feel exhausted throughout the day, but then your head hits the pillow and you can't fall asleep. So now that I've gone over what cortisol does, I've gone over some of the symptoms that you could have with imbalances of cortisol. How do we figure out which imbalance you have? There are 3 ways to test for cortisol. One is to do a blood test, but the blood test is just a point in time, so it doesn't tell us about the patterns of cortisol throughout the day. It's good for diagnosing things such as Addison's or Cushing's disease. Another test is a salivary test where we check your cortisol through the saliva 4 to 5 times a day, in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and sometimes at night, and we get a graph of what happens with your cortisol throughout the day. The last kind of test that can be done is something called a cortisol urinary test, or the test that I really like to use, the Dutch test. And the Dutch test can actually map out your cortisol throughout the day and can show us your cortisol as you're waking up, what's your cortisol towards the middle of the day, the evening, and then towards bedtime when you're going to sleep. To diagnose the more significant forms of cortisol, either being too high or too low, blood tests are good for this. But to diagnose more chronic changes in cortisol levels, the best test to use, in my opinion, is the Dutch test, which is the urine cortisol test. The salivary test is great as well, and I tend to use both of them just depending on what situation my patients have. The one downfall of the Dutch test is that it does not test for urinary cortisol in the middle of the night. Sometimes I have to have a patient do the salivary test because that does test for what the cortisol is right in the middle of the night. Once you've been diagnosed with cortisol imbalance, how do we go about treating it? The strategy that I like to use is actually multiple things. No one thing will help to fix your cortisol. There's many things that have to be taken into consideration. The number one thing that I focus on with my patients is diet. If a patient is very high in cortisol in the morning or midday, sometimes that's related to eating a lot of carbohydrates or having a lot of refined sugars, which can spike your cortisol levels. The first thing to work on is diet, and it has to be tailored tailored to your specific patterns so that your specific pattern of cortisol imbalance can be controlled. Next is using herbs and adaptogens. There are certain herbs and adaptogens that work on your adrenal glands where cortisol is made to help balance your cortisol. Sometimes what I have to do is actually time the dosing of certain adaptogens with the pattern of cortisol irregularity that my patients have. My patients take one type of adaptogen or herb throughout the day. Sometimes they have to take 2 or 3. It really depends on what your imbalance is. Stress management techniques are also crucial. So breathing exercises, practicing yoga, meditation, for example, mindfulness, can all help to regulate your cortisol patterns. But this is something that you really have to work with a healthcare professional to understand. You have to know how the techniques are used, because sometimes if you do it on your own, it just doesn't work as well. Something else that I recommend is actually wearing a continuous glucose monitor. If you get a continuous glucose monitor or CGM, you're able to track your blood sugar levels throughout the day and how certain foods affect your blood sugar, which is in turn tied to your cortisol levels. And the other thing too is a lot of applications or softwares now for tracking blood sugar also allow you to input stressful situations when you're sleeping, when you're exercising, and tying all of this information together can give us a really good idea of how your cortisol levels are also now impacting your blood sugar, but also other measures in your body. Another thing I wanted to mention is acupuncture. So acupuncture is amazing for helping control cortisol levels because it helps you relax. It stimulates a lot of good neurotransmitters and other hormones to be made in your body. So acupuncture is an excellent choice for helping control cortisol levels. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a case of a patient that I helped in controlling her cortisol levels. So this patient in particular came to me feeling very tired. She actually needed to drink coffee throughout the day just to stay awake. And when we checked her cortisol levels, we found that her morning cortisol levels were very low, but at night her cortisol levels were very high. So what I did is I tailored a specific combination of herbs and supplements that helped raise her cortisol levels in the morning and lower them at night. We also worked on mind-body therapies and relaxation techniques. I had her go for a walk every morning, making sure she was getting exercise at the correct time. After several months, she felt much better. She didn't need to drink coffee anymore, felt more relaxed, and we were able to get her cortisol levels back in balance. If you're struggling with any of the issues I discussed today, proper testing and personalized treatment plans can be integral to getting you feeling better. If you want more information, reach out to us today.